The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old decisions. Margaret Hayes sat at the far end of the long table, hands folded neatly in her lap, as if she were waiting for permission to exist. The lawyer hadn't looked at her once since she walked in. No one had. "Let's proceed," he said, adjusting his glasses. Papers slid. Names were called. Assets were assigned. "The house will go to Daniel Hayes." Her son didn't react, just leaned back, satisfied. "The savings account, jointly divided." A soft murmur of approval. Margaret remained still, not surprised, not anymore. "And the remaining items—" The lawyer paused, scanning the last page. For the first time, his tone shifted, just slightly. "There is a final allocation." Daniel smirked. "What? The old junk in the basement?" A few quiet laughs circled the room. The lawyer cleared his throat. Mrs. Margaret Hayes is to receive $1. Silence. Then a short, sharp laugh. "You're kidding," her daughter said, shaking her head. $1? And," the lawyer continued, voice tightening, "partial ownership of the basement structure beneath the original family residence." "The basement?" Daniel repeated, confused. "We don't even use that space." "Then it's perfect," his sister replied. "She finally gets a place of her own." This time, the laughter wasn't quiet. Margaret felt it move through the room like a draft. Cold, familiar, not cruel enough to shock her, just enough to remind her where she stood. Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice as if offering advice. "Mom, don't make this complicated. Just sign it over. We'll take care of everything." Margaret lifted her eyes. "For 42 years, she said softly. "Oh, I thought I already had." The room stilled, but only for a moment. Daniel sighed. "This isn't the time for that." The lawyer slid the document toward her. "It's a simple transfer. You can refuse the asset or assign it to—" "No," Margaret interrupted. It wasn't loud, but it held. Everyone looked at her now, for the first time. She reached for the pen. Her fingers trembled, not from weakness, but from something older, something worn thin over decades of being overlooked. $1, she repeated, almost to herself. Then she signed. The scratch of ink against paper sounded louder than it should have. Daniel shook his head. "I don't understand why you'd even want it." Margaret placed the pen down carefully. "I don't," she said. A pause, then quieter. "But it's the only thing you didn't take." No one answered. The meeting moved on. Just chairs shifted. Conversations resumed. Margaret stood, gathering nothing, because there was nothing left to gather. At the door, she stopped. Just for a second. Not to look back, but to steady herself. Behind her, someone chuckled again. "Imagine that," a voice muttered. "A lifetime for $1 and a basement." Margaret didn't turn around. She just walked out, holding the smallest inheritance in the room, and somehow, the only one that still felt unfinished. Margaret didn't cry when the door closed behind her. The sound was too final for tears. She stood on the front steps a moment longer than necessary, as if her body hadn't caught up with what had just happened. The same porch she had swept every Sunday. The same railing she had painted. Twice. 42 years of small, no invisible work, reduced to something she no longer had permission to touch. "Margaret?" She turned. Mrs. Collins from next door stood by the hedge, concern written across her face. "Everything all right in there?" Margaret held her gaze for a second, then offered a small, careful smile. "They settled everything." "And you?" A pause. "They gave me the basement." Mrs. Collins blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "The basement?" Margaret nodded once, as if confirming it for herself. "Well," the woman said gently, "that doesn't sound right." Margaret didn't answer, because for years, nothing had. She walked down the steps, each one quieter than the last, carrying a single worn suitcase. No one came after her. No voice called her back. The house behind her remained still, already moving on without her. By evening, she sat alone in a narrow rental room above a laundromat. The hum of machines below vibrated through the floor, steady and indifferent. A stranger's place, temporary, like everything else had suddenly become. On the small table lay the documents. She hadn't meant to open them again. But silence has a way of pushing things forward. Margaret unfolded the papers slowly, smoothing each page with care. Names she knew, signatures she had seen 1,000 times. A life written down as if it had always belonged to someone else. Her husband's name appeared over and over, hers, rarely. She let out a quiet breath. That figures. Hours passed without her noticing. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. Inside, the room dimmed around her. She reached the final page, almost closed it, then stopped. There, beneath the printed lines, was something different. Smaller, denser, the kind of text meant to be skipped. Margaret leaned closer. Her fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the paper. She read it once, then again. The hum from downstairs faded into the background. Because suddenly, the basement wasn't just a place. It was a condition, a clause, a detail no one had mentioned. Margaret sat back slowly, her expression unreadable. But something had shifted. Not hope, not yet. But for the first time since she walked out that door, she wasn't thinking about what she had lost. She was thinking about what had been hidden. Margaret didn't sleep. By dawn, the paper was still in her hands, creased now, not from age, but from the way she had held onto it through the night. She read the clause again before leaving, not because she doubted it, but because she knew no one else had bothered to. The street was quiet when she returned. The house stood exactly as she had left it, unchanged, unwelcoming, already forgetting her. Margaret didn't knock. She opened the door like someone who used to belong there. Voices drifted from the kitchen. "Should have just made her sign everything over," her daughter was saying. Daniel answered, low and dismissive. "It's a basement. Let her have it. She won't last a day down there anyway." Margaret stepped inside. The conversation stopped. Daniel turned first. "You forgot something?" "No," Margaret said calmly. "I came for what's mine." A beat of silence. Her daughter crossed her arms. "You mean the basement?" "That's what the paper says." Daniel gave a short laugh, shaking his head. "Then go ahead. It's exactly how you remember it. Cold, damp, and useless." Margaret met his eyes. "We'll see." No one offered to follow. No one offered to help, which she realized was exactly what she needed. The hallway felt narrower than before, or maybe it was just that she walked through it differently now, no longer avoiding the spaces that had never truly been hers. At the end of the corridor, the basement door waited, closed, unremarkable, ignored. Margaret rested her hand on the knob. For a moment, she hesitated, not out of fear, but from something harder to name. A lifetime of being told where she didn't belong doesn't disappear overnight. Behind her, Daniel's voice drifted again, casual, uninterested. "Don't say I didn't warn you." Margaret didn't respond. She turned the handle. The door opened with a low creak, revealing a narrow staircase descending into shadow. The air that rose up was cool, stale, but not entirely untouched. She noticed it immediately. Not the darkness, the stillness. A place abandoned long enough becomes heavy, settled. This didn't feel settled. Margaret stepped down slowly, one hand trailing along the wall. The wood beneath her feet groaned softly, each step announcing her presence to a space that seemed to be listening. At the bottom, she paused. The room stretched out before her, dim, cluttered, layered in dust. But not everywhere. Her eyes moved carefully, deliberately. Something about it, resisted neglect. Margaret took another step forward, then another, and as the door above her eased shut on its own, sealing off the noise of the house, one quiet thought settled in her mind. This wasn't a place no one entered. It was a place no one wanted her to. The first thing Margaret noticed wasn't what was there. It was what wasn't. Dust lay thick across the shelves, the pipes, the corners where time usually settled without being disturbed. But halfway along the far wall, the pattern broke, subtly, almost politely, as if it didn't want to be seen. A section of wood, cleaner, lighter. Margaret didn't move closer right away. She had learned over a lifetime that the smallest details often carried the heaviest truths. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. A voice, Daniel's, muffled through the ceiling. "She'll come back up in 10 minutes. Just wait." Margaret let the sound pass through her without reaction. Then she stepped forward. Her fingers brushed the surface of the wall. The wood was dry, not recently wiped, but not abandoned either, maintained just enough to disappear into everything else. That's not neglect," she murmured under her breath. "That's intention." She moved slowly across the room, eyes adjusting, mapping the space in silence. A workbench sat off to one side, cluttered with rusted tools, except for one corner. Clear, not polished, not neat. Used? Margaret picked up a small hammer, weighing it in her hand. No dust along the handle. No corrosion where fingers had held it. "Who's been down here?" she asked quietly. No answer came, but the question didn't leave. She set the hammer down exactly where she found it. Then she took another step. The floor shifted beneath her. A soft, hollow knock. Margaret froze. She shifted her weight again. Knock. Different from the rest. Not the deep, solid resistance of old foundation wood, but something thinner, something covering. She looked down. The boards were aligned carefully, and almost seamlessly. Too carefully. Margaret crouched, pressing her palm flat against the surface. The chill came through immediately, but beneath it, there was space, a gap where there shouldn't be one. Upstairs, footsteps moved again, slower this time. "Mom?" Daniel called down, his tone edged now with something sharper. "You all right down there?" Margaret didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor. Because suddenly, the clause she had read the night before no longer felt like legal language. It felt like a warning, or an instruction. She tapped the wood again, hollow, deliberate, hidden. Margaret rose to her feet, her breath steady but deeper now. This wasn't a forgotten basement. It wasn't an accident. And whatever had been left behind here had been left for someone who would actually look. Margaret didn't rush. If something had been hidden this carefully, it wasn't meant for hurried hands. She stood over the hollow spot, listening, not just to the house above, but to the quiet logic of the space itself. Whoever built this hadn't relied on locks or obvious seams. They had trusted something else. Patience. Margaret stepped back to the workbench and picked up the same hammer. It felt steadier in her grip now, as if it belonged to the moment. Upstairs, Daniel's voice came again, sharper this time. "Mom, I'm serious. Don't start tearing things apart down there." Margaret looked up at the ceiling. "For 42 years, she said evenly, "I cleaned up after everything you broke." A pause, then silence. She turned back. Instead of striking the wood, she ran the hammer's edge along the seams, testing, listening. One board shifted, barely, not enough to see, enough to know. "There you are," she whispered. She set the hammer down and knelt, pressing her fingers into the narrow gap. The board resisted at first, then gave with a quiet, reluctant lift. A breath of colder air slipped out from below, not stale, sealed. Margaret lifted the plank carefully and set it aside. Beneath it, a recessed handle lay flush with the surface, hidden in plain sight. Her heart didn't race. It steadied. Because this wasn't chance anymore. She pulled. The panel rose slowly, revealing a narrow opening just wide enough for a person to descend. A short ladder disappeared into darkness. Margaret leaned forward, peering down. "Mom?" Daniel's voice again, closer now. Footsteps at the top of the stairs. "What are you doing?" Margaret didn't look up. "Something you never thought to." She placed one foot onto the ladder. "You shouldn't be down there alone," he said, a trace of unease slipping through. Margaret paused halfway down and finally answered him. "I've been alone for a long time, Daniel." Then she continued. The space below wasn't large, but it was deliberate. The air was cooler, untouched by the dampness above. A single overhead bulb flickered to life as her foot reached the ground, triggered by a hidden switch. Margaret blinked. Someone had prepared this place. A small wooden table stood in the center, shelves lined the walls, and on them, neatly stacked, carefully preserved, were boxes, files, envelopes, not scattered, organized, waiting. Margaret stepped forward slowly, as if entering a room that still belonged to someone else. Then her hand hovered over the nearest box before finally lifting the lid. Inside, documents. Dozens of them. No money, no jewelry, just paper. But Margaret knew, in the quiet certainty that comes after a lifetime of being overlooked, this was never about what was visible. Behind her, Daniel's voice faltered from above. "Mom, what is that?" Margaret didn't answer. She picked up the first file, her fingers tracing the edge like it might disappear if she moved too quickly. Because whatever had been hidden beneath this house had not been forgotten. It had been saved. For someone who would finally understand it. The papers didn't look valuable. That was the first deception. No seals. No official stamps on the outside. Just aging folders, labeled in a careful, deliberate hand. The kind of handwriting Margaret recognized immediately, but hadn't seen in years. Her husband's. She froze, not from grief, from recognition. "Mom?" Daniel's voice drifted down again, tighter now. "If this is some kind of old storage, just leave it. We'll deal with it later." Margaret opened the first folder. "No," she said quietly. "You won't." Inside, documents, property records, old surveys, legal correspondence, but something about them didn't match what she had been told for decades. Margaret flipped through the pages, her fingers moving faster now. Parcel maps, boundary lines, signatures. Her husband's name appeared again and again, but not where she expected it. Not as owner, as intermediary. "What?" she whispered. Another file, this one thicker. Inside, letters. Formal, precise, addressed to a name she didn't recognize. See, dates stretching back 30 years. Conversations about holding rights, temporary transfers, undisclosed assets. Margaret's breath slowed. This wasn't inheritance paperwork. This was concealment. "Mom, I'm coming down," Daniel said. "No," she answered immediately. A beat. Then, firmer. "Stay where you are." Something in her voice made him stop. Margaret opened the next folder. Her hands didn't tremble anymore. They steadied, because now, the pieces were aligning. The house, the one her children had fought over, wasn't the center of anything. It was a cover. The land beneath it, extended further than anyone had ever admitted. Quiet acquisitions, hidden agreements, rights that had never been publicly recorded. And at the center of it, one clause. The same clause she had read the night before. Margaret found it again, and this time in its full context, not buried in fine print, but spelled out in unmistakable terms. Upon dissolution of the primary estate, all unregistered claims and subsurface rights revert to the designated silent partner. Margaret stared at the name beneath it. Not her husband, not her children, her. Her signature followed, dated decades ago. A document she had signed, without being told what it meant. Daniel's voice broke through again, sharper now. Mom, what's going on down there? Margaret closed the folder slowly. For years, she said, her voice calm but no longer soft. You thought this house was everything. She looked around the hidden room, at the shelves, the records, the truth that had been buried beneath their feet. It wasn't even the beginning. Silence. Then Daniel again. But this time, uncertain. What are you talking about? Margaret picked up another file, her eyes clearer than they had been in years. I'm talking about something your father made sure no one would ever look for. A pause. Then quietly, except me. Because now she understood. The basement wasn't what they gave her. It was what they failed to take. And buried inside it was the part of the inheritance that had never been meant for them at all. They didn't wait long. By the second morning, the house felt different. Not louder, not fuller, just aware. Like something had shifted beneath it, and now everyone could feel it without knowing why. Margaret was already in the basement when the front door opened. Footsteps. More than usual. Voices she didn't recognize. She didn't rush to hide anything. Instead, she placed the folders back into their boxes. Carefully, deliberately, then climbed the ladder and stepped into the dim light of the basement above. Daniel was there. But he wasn't alone. Two men in tailored suits stood behind him, their presence quiet but unmistakable. Not family, not neighbors. Business. Mom, Daniel said too quickly. We need to talk. Margaret brushed the dust from her hands. You've already said enough. One of the men stepped forward, offering a polite, practiced smile. Mrs. Hayes, my name is Carter. We represent a group interested in resolving any confusion regarding the property. Confusion? Margaret repeated. The man nodded slightly. These kinds of legacy assets can be complicated. Paperwork gets misplaced. Intentions get misunderstood. Margaret held his gaze. Nothing was misplaced, she said. It was hidden. The second man spoke this time, his tone firmer. Oh, all the more reason to settle this quickly. We're prepared to make a generous offer for your portion. Daniel shifted beside them. Mom, just hear them out. This doesn't have to turn into something difficult. Margaret looked at him, really looked this time. For you, she said quietly. It already was. Silence stretched between them. Carter adjusted his cuff, then opened a slim briefcase. Inside, documents neatly arranged, and beneath them, a glimpse of something else. Money. A clean transfer, he said. You walk away, no complications, no drawn-out disputes. Margaret didn't step closer. Instead, she folded her hands in front of her, the same way she had in the lawyer's office. Only this time, it wasn't to make herself smaller. You came very quickly, she said. Carter's smile tightened. We monitor these situations closely. Of course you do. Daniel exhaled, impatience creeping in. Mom, please, it's just paperwork. You don't even know what you're dealing with. Margaret's expression didn't change. That's where you're wrong. She took a slow step forward, not toward the briefcase, but toward the space between them. For the first time, she said, her voice steady. I do. The room shifted, not physically, but in the way people stood, the way they watched her now, not with dismissal, but with calculation, because whatever they thought she was before, she wasn't that anymore. I'm not selling, Margaret said. No hesitation, no apology, just truth. And for the first time since they walked in, no one laughed. The room they chose wasn't meant for people like her. Glass walls, polished table, everything transparent, except the truth. Margaret sat at one end, the same way she had in the lawyer's office, but this time, no one forgot she was there. Across from her, Carter arranged his papers with careful precision. Daniel sat beside him, restless, avoiding her eyes. You understand, Carter began, voice measured, that what you're claiming is highly irregular. Margaret didn't look at him. She opened the folder in front of her and turned it so the others could see. I'm not claiming anything, she said. I'm reading what was written. A pause. The second man leaned forward. Those documents were never meant to be interpreted that way. Margaret's eyes lifted slowly. Then they shouldn't have been written that way. Silence. It didn't last long. Carter slid a new document across the table. We've prepared a resolution. It's fair. I'm generous even. You sign, and this ends today. Margaret glanced at the page. Numbers. Large ones. More than she had seen in her entire life. Daniel finally spoke. Mom, this is more than enough. You don't need to fight this. Margaret studied his face. Not the man he was now, but the boy he used to be. The one she had raised. The one who used to ask her what was right. What I need, she said quietly, is to understand why no one told me. Daniel shifted, uncomfortable. Told you what? Margaret tapped the document she had brought. That I was never just part of this family. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried. That I was part of what built it. The second man exhaled sharply. Mrs. Hayes, with respect, this isn't about sentiment. It's about legality. Margaret nodded once. More exactly. She reached into her folder and pulled out another sheet, older, worn at the edges. My signature, she said, placing it on the table. 32 years ago. Carter's expression tightened. You had no authority at the time. I had trust, Margaret interrupted. That landed harder than anything else she'd said. For decades, she continued, I signed what I was told to sign. I stayed where I was told to stay. And I never asked what it meant. She leaned back slightly, her gaze steady now. That wasn't ignorance, she said. That was obedience. No one spoke, because there was nothing easy to say. Margaret looked at the papers spread between them, the offers, the contracts, the quiet attempts to close something that was never meant to be opened. You keep telling me I don't understand what I'm holding, she said. A breath. Then, calmly, you're right. Carter blinked. Margaret's expression didn't change. I don't understand why it was hidden, she continued, or why it matters so much to you now. She paused. But I do understand one thing. Her hand rested lightly on the documents. It was never yours to take. The air in the room shifted, not with noise, with pressure, because for the first time, this wasn't a negotiation. It was a line. And Margaret had just drawn it. They didn't raise their voices after that. They lowered them, and somehow, that felt more dangerous. The meeting ended without resolution, but not without intention. By evening, Margaret returned to the house, not as a guest, not as family, but as someone who now understood why the ground beneath it mattered. The basement light was already on. Daniel stood near the workbench, a folder in his hands. Alone this time. I figured you'd come back, he said without looking up. Margaret closed the door behind her. This is the only place I have left. Daniel nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something for him. Then he turned, holding out the folder. This is the final offer. Margaret didn't take it. You should read it, he insisted. All of it. A pause. Then she stepped forward and opened the folder where he held it. More numbers. Higher than before. But that wasn't what caught her attention. Attached. Relocation arrangements. A house. A clean start. Everything packaged neatly, like a life that could be replaced if the price was right. Daniel watched her carefully. You won't have to worry about anything again. Margaret closed the folder. I wasn't worried before, she said. He exhaled sharply. Come on, Mom. This isn't about pride. It's about reality. Margaret looked at him, her expression steady. Reality, she repeated, is that for years, I lived in a house I didn't own, signing papers I didn't understand, trusting people who never told me the truth. Daniel's jaw tightened. We didn't know either. Margaret tilted her head slightly. No, she said. You just didn't ask. That landed. He looked away first. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he muttered. Margaret stepped past him, her hand brushing lightly against the edge of the hidden panel. This isn't hard, she said. It's clear. Daniel turned back. Clear? She nodded. You want me to walk away? She said. So none of this ever has to be explained. Silence, then quieter, and so it can all stay buried. Daniel didn't deny it, didn't confirm it either. He just stood there, waiting. Because this was the moment they had all expected. The moment where she would finally choose the easier path. The safer one. Margaret picked up the folder again, holding it for a second longer this time. Then she placed it back in his hands. I'm not starting over, she said. Daniel frowned. What does that even mean? Margaret met his eyes, calm, certain, unmovable. It means, she said, I'm not trading the truth for comfort. A breath. Then, softer. I've done that once already. She stepped back toward the ladder, her decision already behind her. And I'm not doing it again. Daniel didn't follow, because for the first time in his life, there was nothing left he could offer her that she actually wanted. A year later, no one laughed about the basement. They spoke about it quietly, if they spoke about it at all. Margaret stood at the bottom of the same stairs, her hand resting lightly against the wall she had once followed in the dark. The air no longer felt sealed or forgotten. It carried warmth now, light, life. The hidden space hadn't disappeared. It had been opened. Boxes once stacked in silence were now organized, cataloged, understood. The documents had done more than reveal ownership. They had rewritten it. Legal claims corrected. Land rights restored. What had been buried under layers of silence had finally been brought into the open. Not for profit, for truth. Mrs. Hayes? Margaret turned. A woman stood near the entrance, older, uncertain, holding a small bag the way Margaret once had. They said I could come here, she said softly. Just for a few days. Margaret studied her for a moment, then nodded. You can stay as long as you need. The woman's shoulders dropped, relief quiet but visible. Thank you. Margaret gestured toward the small table, no longer covered in files, but set with a lamp, 2 chairs, and a pot of tea. It's not much, she said. The woman shook her head. It's more than I had. Margaret understood that. Better than most. Upstairs, the house had changed hands more than once over the year. Daniel had sold his portion. The others followed. None of them stayed long. Too many questions. Too many answers they didn't want. Margaret never went back up there. She didn't need to. Down here, she had built something that hadn't existed before. Not just a space, but a place. A quiet refuge for those who had been overlooked, dismissed, or quietly erased from their own lives. A basement, they had called it. As if that was all it could ever be. Why didn't you take the money? The woman asked after a while, sitting carefully at the table. Margaret poured the tea slowly, letting the question settle before answering. They thought they gave me nothing, she said. The woman looked up. Margaret met her eyes, a faint smile touching her lips, not triumphant, not bitter, just certain. But they gave me the only thing they couldn't take back. She placed the cup gently in front of her. Myself. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything that had once been missing. Margaret glanced around the room. The light, the quiet voices, the steady presence of people who no longer felt invisible. This wasn't what she had lost. It was what had been waiting. Not in the house above, not in the money they offered, but in the part of her life that had been written out. And then, finally, returned. $1. A basement. That's what they thought they left her with. Margaret lifted her cup, hands steady. They were wrong, because the real inheritance had never been about what was given. It was about what was finally understood, and what she chose to build from it.